It's very frightening, and I don't think you need to have a sister or a mother or in anything to be very concerned, because I think a lot of people say no.
Always tying the worth of a woman to a man.
I know. Make it relevant to yourself. It's a human being. So.
Welcome everybody to today's episode at Africa for Dummies, where we keep all things Africa. Today we're going to have a deep dive into one of the biggest global events ever, hosted on African soil. Well, aside from the 2010 FIFA World Cup. The 2025 G20 summit in Johannesburg. Or is it Johannesburg? I can't remember. I don't know. Johannesburg. We're going to Joburg, if you're from Josie, if you're from the ends. We're going to explore what the G20 actually is, why the US didn't fully show up, the GBV protests that reshaped the national conversation, and whether the G20 still matters for Africans today. It's a story of politics, people, and the shifting of global power. Welcome everybody to the Africa for Dummies podcast. But before we jump into this particular topic, I'd like to ask you to please like, share, subscribe, comment down in the comments below. It really helps us to spread the word and get our channel out there. So, Zenge, how are you doing today, man?
Yeah, not too bad. Just surviving, end of year rush.
The new favorite of the Africa for Dummies podcast. I saw a lot of comments on the last video, basically giving you big shout outs, man. You have a fan base now. That would be really cool. I would really imagine people have pictures of you like Che Guevara on their shirts or something. That would be really sick.
No thanks. My head is big enough.
It is big enough, yeah. Yeah, so anyways, jumping into the G20 summit. So Zenge, could you just tell us like a brief summary of what the G20 is?
So the G20 stands for Group of 20. It's meant to be the 20 largest and strategic economies in the world. It was preceded before by the G7, 1975, but the G20 was created in 1999 following the 1997 to 1998 Asian financial crisis. It was meant to basically strengthen and make resilient the financial architecture and stability of countries. The G20 was meant to be more inclusive. It was meant to be much bigger and promise a larger portion of the world's economy. And that's actually true because the G20 is comprised of 85% of the global GDP and 75% of the global trade as well. 65% of the world population, we're 8 billion people. Now just imagine a 65% chunk of that. And of course, the reason is to create financial stability, as I said, address challenges as they come. Because of the economy is interlinked and interdependent to so many other things. They're also going to be addressing climate change, going to be addressing energy, trade, health, development, and also peace and security. And so if we look at the G20 and its evolution, they have come into prominence during the 2008 crisis, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you look at successes, the 2008 global financial crisis response was a big success. And then also other initiatives like health initiatives, digital economy initiatives. And then also supporting things like the common framework for debt treatment, which Zambia was actually one of the first, if not the first candidate. Zambia was the first developing country to default in its debt during the COVID era. And the common framework for debt treatment actually dealt with Zambia and managed to restructure 9.3 billion out of what today is about $23 billion of Zambia's external debt. Mind you, Zambia's GDP is around 30 billion, just under 30 billion. So that's a huge chunk of Zambia's productivity. And so they're able to get, official bilateral state lenders, 6.3 billion plus 3 billion from the bondholders, and known as the Paris Club unofficially, or so that's generally one of the G20's big sort of successes. And the failures normally are on the fact that this is the G20. It's a forum of countries and it's not necessarily binding. Yeah, it's not binding. So it's not going to be law. There is no particular obligation that you should do it. It's just, it's fundamentally based on goodwill, and the implementation is based on the resources and capacity for countries to actually do these things and nationalize them in their national systems. And the impact is not seen to be very pronounced given the increase in global inequality. And that's another criticism. And then another criticism also is the accountability. This is a massive declaration, which you're going to go into. Massive declaration, 30 pages, 12, I think, 112 different paragraphs, 20 countries. 22. Yeah.
Oh,
12
12 paragraphs. Yeah.
Yeah. And then 20 different countries with very different systems. We're talking about all of these countries, from China, Argentina, South Africa, So it's a very difficult thing to compromise and come to a consensus and then implement.
Yeah.
Major stepping blocks in that is, of course, the absence of the United States. But before I do that, let me just outline clearly who is in the G20, right? We've got Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, China, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, and the United States of America. Of course, the largest economy in this is the United States of America with $28.78 trillion. And then the poorest country in the when I say poor, I'm strictly talking about GDP. So don't come at me with different definitions. South Africa with 410 Yeah, South Africa has 410 billion, although it's the most industrialized and currently biggest economy in Africa right now. And then there's also institutes or organizations rather. And then, so for those who know the European Union, it's more of a supranational state. So European Union comes with 22 trillion. African Union comes with around 3 trillion. Those are also part of the G20. These organizations or supranational.
Right. So we're discussing about inequality in one of the most unequal countries in the world, which is pretty interesting. But you talked about this 85% GDP, like these are countries that literally give out 85% GDP, 85% of the GDP of the world. And I believe a large chunk of that belongs to the United States of America. And however, there was one person missing from one country, I should say, missing from the G20, and that is the United States President Donald Trump, who did not attend the G20 summit and actually refused to endorse the declaration that you mentioned. I don't like it. And that's a bad Trump, but reports indicate the US pressured South Africa not to adopt the declaration without US involvement. And South Africa, in turn, I don't know if they did this in turn, but Sir Ramaphosa says this was protocol, refused to hand over the presidency to a low-level U.S. diplomat, asserting diplomatic independence. So this kind of shows the tension that's existing within the group that's supposed to be agreeing. What say you, Zenge?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a sign of this distrust in multilateralism. Multilateralism basically is this idea that multiple countries can come together, create an organization or forum, and then make decisions to advance global prosperity. Things like the United Nations. Key things that we all know and are used to that the US is sort of pulling out. And the US played a humongous role in creating many of these institutions, but the Trump type of foreign policy doesn't have an exact faith in them. They do attend some of these things, but they skip a lot of them. So like the climate change conference, the 30th climate change conference that happened in Brazil, Trump wasn't there. G20, Trump wasn't there either. But for the G20, specifically under South Africa's presidency, this whole year, South Africa and the United States have been at loggerheads. I think after the Zelensky visit, the famous one earlier in the year, where Trump was like, you have no cards to Zelensky and so on. And why aren't you wearing a suit? All those things.
Why don't you wear a suit? Why don't you wear a suit? You're at the highest level in this country's office, and you refuse to wear a suit. Just want to see do you own a suit?
Yeah, problems.
He basically, the Trump-Ramaphosa meeting in May was perhaps the most dramatic fallout of White House visits this year between Trump. Primarily because of the Afrikaner refugee and genocide conspiracy, which is false. The perception or the distorted belief that there is a genocide of white South Africans, particularly white South African farmers, the South African institutes, as well as government institutes, have dispelled this and said actually the majority of farmers are actually black. The majority of deaths are black in terms of crime. And actually, the number one issue, according to the race relations think tank in South Africa, the number one issue among South Africans is not necessarily race, but more so crime. So it's fundamentally a crime issue. And then also, in addition to that, is also South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ on grounds of genocide. And that has been another sticking issue that the United States is not necessarily pleased with, considering Israel is a very strong ally. And Trump himself is a very strong supporter of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel, for that matter. So And this also comes around the same time that they have cancelled the visa of the former minister, basically the Foreign Affairs and External Relations Minister, Naledi Pandor, the former one. Right now it's Ronald Lamola, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister. But he is just as adamant and headed about the South Africa's position on Israel and changing on that, as well as, the South African Foreign Ministry, the presidency office was quite insulted, I think, by not only Caroline Levitt, who is the spokesperson in the White House, describing what Ramaphosa said about America wanting to participate last minute, and she characterized Ramaphosa to be running his mouth, in quotation marks.
Is not a shift. The United States is not participating in official talks at the G20 in South Africa. I saw the South African president running his mouth a little bit against the United States and the president of the United States earlier today, and that language is not appreciated by the president or his team.
So running his mouth, a foreign head of state, one of probably the most strategic, respected heads of states across the African continent and in the global south as well. It's quite disrespectful. And so South African foreign actors and the presidency office didn't take that lightly. And they simply felt disrespected about that, but also the assumption that America would participate, but at a lower level, and that Ramaphosa, head of state, head of government, South Africa, will be handing over G20 presidency to a junior diplomatic officer, charge d'affaires, which is essentially an interim ambassador.
Right.
So yeah, that's going to be another issue that we're going to see unfold, because basically the United States will be taking over the G20, and for 2026, and it's going to have to adopt this declaration or not adopt this declaration. As you said, it has been already rejected. It's going to be very interesting to see, first of all, how they hand over and what they'll do with the declaration anyway. And in 2027, it'll be the UK. And then after that, 2028 will be South Korea.
Right. And so just to summarize for all of our listeners, South Africa and the United States have this disagreement about the quote-unquote Afrikaans genocide, which South Africa has on many occasions denounced and said doesn't exist. But many, what can I call them, institutions have come out and stated that the problem is crime, which affects everybody, not just white South African farmers. So as you mentioned, the problem in South Africa. Right, actually, that's a great point. We actually have done multiple episodes on South Africa, so please be sure to check them out. If you check them out on our podcast platforms, on YouTube, I think we did a number of episodes with Sizwe and Pofu Walsh diving into this issue specifically. And also, I think we've done also a couple of episodes where we just talked about it. So moving, as you mentioned, crime is a very serious issue in South Africa. And unfortunately, gender-based violence in South Africa is also really, really prominent. And so ahead of I'm not as tech savvy, or I'm not very into the social media space, but I read online that many people had turned their profile pictures to purple, essentially to sort of represent and to protest against the really alarming numbers of GBV, gender-based violence in South Africa. I believe South Africa, if I'm not correct, I read somewhere that South Africa is like it's one of the most unsafe countries to be a woman. I believe there was another alarming statistic that came down that said that on average 15 women are murdered daily due to gender-based violence, and this led to people using this opportunity of the G20 to sort of come up and force Ramaphosa. And basically there was a symbolic 15-minute lie down to represent the 15 women murdered daily statistic. And under pressure, Ramaphosa declared gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster. Right now, there are two sides to this declaration, which is on one side, people are saying this is a good thing because it means that this issue now is going to probably get more government support, and also more money is going to come towards this, and also it's been addressed as well. But then on the other side, people are doubting because they're saying, hey, maybe Sir Ramaphosa is just saying this and we're not going to see any actions come out. I'm curious to see what have you read about this issue, Zenge?
Yeah, no, I did some reading on this stuff, but I think I was really interested in the human cases, where you sort of put names behind these of statistic. There was the case of Volerato Mongale, a 30-year-old woman who was killed in May 2025 after going on what she thought was a date. And then there was a girl called Lihona Fose, who was 14 years old. and she was just basically found murdered and chopped up into pieces in 2025, June this year. And so these, when you put sort of faces into these things and you realize the ages and just what they might have been going through, it's very scary. I mean, we are both not women, so we speak of this with a great deal of humility when we do not understand the first person perspectives, but it's very frightening, and I don't think you need to have a sister or a mother or in anything to be very concerned, because I think a lot of people say, no, it was a man.
Right.
A
Always
woman.
tying the worth of a woman to a man.
I
right?
know, make it relevant to yourself. It's a human being. So, yeah. There's a lot of stuff out there, but I think it's probably something that needs to be spoken up a bit more, because there was protests in Kenya also, femicide. Zambia, there was also protest about it on defilement, child defilement, young children being raped. Yeah, they call it defilement, but yeah. So I think it's very sombering news.
Yeah, unfortunately. However, hoping that this declaration will actually lead to some action on the ground. And looking at some of the other major outcomes of the 2025 G20 summit, Zenge, you can stop me at any point if you want to address any of these. But this was, as mentioned before, a 122-point declaration, which was adopted. It's very unusual for it to be adopted on the first day of the G20 summit. Then there was also the debt relief. So strengthening G20 common framework, so promoting more debt transparency and supporting voluntary debt for climate swaps. As you mentioned, this is it's major. It's largely a financial meeting, right? So you have these financial reforms like the IMF quota realignment, increased African representation, over 100 billion in special drawing rights for vulnerable nation. For those of you who want to dive deeper into the IMF and special drawing rights, please check out our podcast. I think it's also on YouTube. We did with Professor Danny Bradlow, where we discuss the IMF and how it affects our country. I think it's one of our oldest, one of our first actual podcasts. So you can feel free to scroll down. Then there's climate and energy, where there was a commitment to triple global renewable capacity and double energy efficiency by 2030 for support for just energy transitions and local mineral value chains. Then there was the disaster resilience, which is universal early warning systems by 2027 and new recovery readiness frameworks. Then there was digital and innovation, support for AI capacity building in Africa, social inclusion, so supporting youth people and reducing unemployment rates, and also narrowing gender labor gaps. Then there was also global governance, calls for the UN Security Council reform, and sustained African participation in global financial discussions. I don't know if I missed any there, Zenge.
The corruption one? Yeah, that's the only one that you missed. But I think if we sort of wrap it up and understand what all of this means, I think this G20 has obviously been dominated by the absence of the United States, but it's at the same time, from South Africa's view, seen as quite successful despite the absence of the United States. But it is also a reckoning moment. Is this a moment where we can now understand that, okay, can we make decisions without the United States? Can we now, can the world live without the United States? Personally, I think the United States is a superpower, but it's very much a receding superpower in terms of its share of the GDP in the world. It's still a massive military power. There's things that America can do, like, presence in every corner of the world militarily that no other country can do. China is increasing its military capacity, but that it's still very big gap, right? In terms of nuclear weapons, neck and neck with Russia. But economically, the competition is quite serious, and there's many countries that are chipping away at US-dominated type of forums and systems, not only because the United States is in itself forfeiting that duty, berating the United Nations, defunding the United Nations, defunding peace support operations, cutting off massive aid mechanisms, and just distrust in multilateralism. And I think one thing that leaves us to is this idea of different countries creating their own mini, not necessarily alternatives, but trying to rewire the way international law and order is done. The Shanghai Corporation, China has the Shanghai Corporation, there's BRICS, there's a bank that is also affiliated with BRICS, all of these other things. They're not as big as the UN, they're not as big as G20, and they do not have as comprehensive a representation. But they are all attempts at what people are uncomfortable with, which is the unipolarity of the United States, which is unipolarity basically means there's one superpower and everyone just falls in line. Multipolarity means there's multiple powers, with different zones of influence and different competencies. And that leaves smaller countries in a sort of space to either hedge or restore faith in multilateralism, which is what Costa, who is the president of the European Council, the European Union has a commission president, Ursula von der Leyen, and then there's the presidential level. That's Costa. And basically he said we should look more at multilateralism rather than multipolarity. But I would hope that multipolarity results in multilateralism. So I think that's my 2 cents on it. The world still needs the United States. It's still a critical actor to do things and implement things. But I think the United States has to also understand that it lives with 193 other countries, right? And so you kind of have to start understanding these countries and entertain their concerns and challenges. I don't think it's in the United States' interest to simply abandon the world or try and sabotage the world in the way that it seemed to be doing in the G20.
Right. I think that's a really good summary. I think sober summary. So I guess to wrap it up, the G20 still a very important financial meeting of the big players, the global big players. However, question mark still on whether some of these agreements that we've mentioned are actually going to be implemented, as they are non-binding. So non-binding is the word of the day. So yep, for everyone that's listening, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching this to the end. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss any of the episodes that we're going to be releasing. Please leave a comment if you disagree, agree, or if you want to say something. We definitely read all the comments, or at least I do. I read all the comments. What else? Am I missing anything? Please be sure to follow us on all platforms, on Instagram, TikTok, where we post the current, news and any other information regarding Africa for Dummies. And also you can also influence the channel by sending us any topics of discussion you would like to see. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening, and see you guys on the next one.
I am an African.